Hi everyone, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to be, it feels like I'm amongst friends. So, well, I am amongst friends, so that's great. So welcome to you all. Thanks for dropping in on this call today. So my responsibility is to talk to you about authentic leadership. When I first took over my own church as incumbent in Harrow in northwest London, I took hold of this Edwardianship of a building. And when you walked in, you knew it was Anglican because there's this sort of sweet and sour smell, which we call Anglican damp. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, but you can just walk into an Anglican church and you get a waft of this powerful, pungent, sweet and sour kind of smell. And I remember walking into the building for the first time and being overwhelmed by the power of this sort of damp and sweet, nasty Anglican smell. And I thought, oh, we've got to deal with that because no one's going to want to come to this church if it smells this bad. So the toilets were in a terrible state. I remember paid something like £16,000 to have the toilets ripped out and replaced. And I thought, you know, now everything is going to be good. We're in good shape. But about 6 months after doing that project, I remember just sitting down at my desk and getting an overwhelming smell of this Anglican damp, thinking if I spent all this money, I'd done up the sort of ground floor of the building and it all looked fantastic. But I thought, have I spent all this money for me to then still be affronted by the same problem? And a couple of months later, I was walking around the back of the church. It was a huge building. It had a medical practice in it. And I came across a small door to a part of the building that I'd not entered before. So I asked the handyman if I could go in there. And he was typically sort of sucking his teeth, telling me that no one went in there and that I had no business going in there. But I managed to wrestle a key off him and got the door open. And as I opened the door, I was immediately confronted by the incredible depth of this smell. And I shone my camera torch in through the door, and there it was just rippling brown water. And it turned out that the church had a basement that was equivalent to sort of two very good sized rooms. And they were completely flooded with this brassy, stinking water. I thought it was just Anglican damp, but actually there was an Anglican sea under our building. And I called the fire brigade and said, oh, hello, I'm the new vicar. You know, our church is flooded. I didn't tell them it was flooded in sort of 1902. I just said the church is flooded. And they came around with a fire engine and spent the next 5 hours pumping out the bottom of the church. And they reckon we got rid of about 3,000 gallons of water. It took about 5 hours to pump out. And inside was all the detritus of our Scout hut history. So we were sort of pulling out antique paddles from canoes and all sorts of rusted rubbish. And over time, we dried it out. We put a pump in to keep all the water out. And a young guy from my church set up a heavy weights gym in there in the early mornings. He was doing weights and listening to the Lord. And I thought that's really the journey of authentic leadership. You know, we try and dress up the ground floor of our lives, but there's this stink of inauthenticity that often follows us around, feeling of fraudulence that you can never kind of get away from, no matter how much you redecorate and kind of clean and cleanse and spray aerosols. You're still plagued by this sense that you're not quite the real deal. They're not really fulfilling the calling of God, or you're not worthy for the calling that God has placed on your life. And all the time we dress up the ground floor when in fact it's the basement of our lives that needs to be pumped out. And the job of working towards an authentic leadership life is about pumping out the shame basement and replacing it with an integrity gym, where we're getting stronger and more real and more honest with the Lord. And so that image, taking that image forward, what's that really look like for us as authentic leaders? And how can we become authentic leaders? What's it really look like? The fact that you guys are on this call is a really good sign, because if you set your heart towards transformation, the Lord honors our hearts and our determination to seek that transformation. And if you're willing to ask yourself hard questions around yourself and your nature, then you're well set for leadership. Really, this talk should be delivered to people who don't want to be on this talk rather than the people who do. If you think about it, the starting point for inauthenticity is a good place to begin. I want you just to think for a minute about this idea around the relationship between success and security. So most of our issues with inauthenticity come because the energy behind our leadership is flowing in the wrong direction. So if I went into a bank and I chatted to colleagues in their 50s particularly and said, you know, you're really successful. How much more successful do you want to be? They'd often say, oh, well, I just want to get secure. So I want a bigger pension pot, or I want a final promotion before I can retire. So their assumption is that success is a vehicle towards my security. And people talk in financial terms about reaching a point of security. But what if this model was inverted? What if authentic leadership was dependent upon a success which flowed out of a security rather than a success that flowed towards a security? So my suggestion to you at the start of this talk is this idea that we're so often driving towards success or for success for the sake of getting secure. But actually authentic leadership comes from a place of security, and that leads us towards the conditions within which we are most likely to be successful. So Christian ministry doesn't enable us to become more authentic leaders. Our authenticity is rooted in an identity which is the priori measure by which we then become leaders who are successful. So an identity question, if you like, is the preeminent question in our understanding of what it means to be an authentic leader. And however hard we try to deny it, Christian leadership is awash with leaders who are deeply insecure, who are trying to find success in order that they might finally feel secure. I spend a lot of my time coaching leaders, and many of the senior leaders I work with say things like, well, I feel like a fraud. I don't think I should be in leadership. Maybe, if I was a bit more successful, then I'd feel like I was worthy of the call that I'm carrying. If only my church had 150 more people, then I'd be able to retire. Those kind of ideas. And they're alive in all of us, but they often orientate around this idea of, how can I find my security? When I want to suggest to you that my security is the preeminence by which I might find my success. Of course, when we're carrying a vulnerability or an insecurity, we often find a way of compensating for that insecurity. And that's often the way that we entered into leadership. So these are what we call our superpowers. And they're a bit of a smokescreen, really. But if you think about Superman for a minute, he has a superpower which is come from his home on the planet Krypton, which gives him incredible strength. But in his ministry of helping other people, kryptonite becomes his super vulnerability, and that's the means by which Lex Luthor manages to disable his power. And for us in leadership, remaining authentic is really challenging when you carry a superpower. There's people's assumptions of you elevate you to superhero status, and then it's very, very hard for you to acknowledge your true vulnerability. And that inability to acknowledge your vulnerability becomes your super vulnerability, and that then in turn becomes your shame basement. So if you think about leaders who are known for incredible things, being known for an incredible thing can be a curse as much as a blessing. And we've seen that recently in the church globally, when you're a brilliant apologist like Ravi Zacharias falls from grace because he's known so well for the superpower of apologetics, he's unable to acknowledge the super vulnerability of his own sexual brokenness. Or when your superpower is loving people who have physical disabilities, like Jean Vanier, and yet your vulnerabilities and your lusts and desires aren't acknowledged because your super capacity, your superhero status, your super strength actually masks all these, and you become unable to connect. Now, on a lesser level, all of us will struggle when our super capacity overtakes us and disconnects us from our super vulnerability. In fact, our super capacity will become the thing which masks and becomes our super vulnerability. So, I spend a lot of time talking to crowds of people about different things, and people still say, well, you're Will Van Hout, you're the emotional health expert. So my super capacity becomes my super vulnerability. What's it mean then when I have an emotional health problem? And I have an emotional health problem, so I have a diagnosed mental health condition called generalized anxiety disorder. So I carry a condition. Now, do I live inauthentically by even saying, well, you've clearly got it sorted out because you can talk in this way about these things? Or your actual mental health condition gets glossed over with, well, it's not really a thing for you because you fixed it. So how do you live authentically when your superpower also becomes your super vulnerability? Well, if we're insecure, then our superpower will get bigger and our super vulnerability will also get bigger. So we have to stay connected to the reason that we're doing what we're doing in the first place. And that ultimately comes down to an identity casing to say, actually, God has called me by name and he's made me his own. And that rootedness in an identity of humility is the thing that will really preserve us long-term in authentic leadership. But it's not as simple as just saying, well, Jesus is the answer. That's something we've heard an awful lot, and yet leaders who say that still fall. So what's the bigger energy behind this, and why are we driven towards success making for the sake of finding security? Well, this all comes down to the idea of shame and how shame impacts us as leaders. This is Simon Rattle, who's just, I think, retired from the London Symphonic Orchestra, and I love this picture. It reminds me of Edvard Munch's The Scream. It's a kind of visceral picture, and it really expresses, you know, extreme levels of power. If you think about an orchestra, you might, if I asked you, you know, what's the most powerful instrument in an orchestra? You might say, well, the trombone or the timpani drums, or, you know, the double bass. I don't know what you'd say, but it's probably a significant and voluminous instrument. But what if I told you that the most powerful instrument in the orchestra is the one that makes no noise? Have a look at what's in Simon Rattle's hands, and you'll see just a little piece of stick, just a little baton. And yet that little baton commands and controls the whole orchestra. It gets to determine everything within the orchestra, everything that's played, the speed, the tone, the pitch, which instruments play at which time. And University of Glasgow argues that there are only 4 basic emotions: happy, fear, surprise, anger, disgust, and sadness. I know it sounds like 6, but they couple the first, the 2 in the middle. You know, the idea here is that imagine that the orchestra is made up of the woodwind, the strings, the percussion, and the brass. They're the 4 emotional elements of the orchestra. If they're commanded by shame, they will always make a discordant sound. So our emotions are often hijacked by shame. Shame says you can only show your superpower. You can never show your super vulnerability. And in that way, we become inauthentic as leaders. Shame says you aren't enough. Shame says compared to your peers, you're failing. Shame says there's stuff in your back room which no one must see, otherwise you'd never be in leadership. And so most of the leaders I coach to a level feel like frauds. They say, well, I feel like a fraud. And they nearly always feel most fraudulent when they're finding themselves to be most successful in terms of their measured impacts. So, you know, if you receive an award, I'm a fraud. Why am I receiving this? And it's difficult to uncouple this from British culture too, where we have this faux humility that says, oh no, so, you know, it's not really me, it's somebody else. In Europe, we don't really have that. I'm Dutch origin, and Dutch are very good at receiving prizes. So I know that it's not culture for me. I know it's shame. But shame says, you know, you shouldn't be, or if they only knew, you wouldn't. And I think shame is increasing, not decreasing, in our culture because of the presentational nature of social media and our ability to make comparisons to one another. But I want you to imagine that the shame conductor is having a field day in our emotions, just like the basement in the church that I worked in. You know, it's bubbling away, and this diffuse and non-sounding emotion is augmenting other emotions that we might be experiencing. So you can't shame. You can conjugate the verbs of happiness. You know, I was happy, I am happy, I will be happy. Or anger, I was angry, I am angry, I will be angry. But you can't conjugate shame. I was shame, I am shaming, I will shame. It doesn't conjugate. It's amorphous. It's not something you can do. It's only something you can be. And psychologists say that shame is one of the earliest emotions. Interestingly, Charles Darwin identified shame in humans only. It's one of the things that he defined that made us only human. So a baby giraffe doesn't come out of a giraffe and suddenly look around and see other giraffes and get really embarrassed and hide its face. But a human, when it's born, as a baby, will look at another unknown adult face and turn its face away in shame or embarrassment. And that distinctive, which I think is actually part of what original sin looks like, is something that we carry. Only humans carry. Only humans can feel ashamed. And that has such a big impact on how we feel as leaders. Are we authentic, you know, in our leadership? Of course, the fraudulence that we feel, that sense of otherness, is again fueling the same problem that we face when it comes to our inauthenticity. Because the primary way in which we understand ourselves as inauthentic people is that I'm a fraud. Guilt is an I am statement. I did statement, but shame is a I am statement. And the challenge for Christian leaders is that you can deal with guilt at the cross. Lord, forgive me for my sins. But how does shame work out in terms of our redemptive experience? Lord, forgive me for being me. Of course, I believe the cross is efficacious for our release from shame. But so often we've coupled together guilt and shame in the Christian church. Lots of songs have been, no guilt in life, no shame, death. Christ is alive in me. Yes, Jesus dealt with our guilt on the cross, but he also dealt with our shame. But guilt and shame aren't the same experience. And as leaders, we have to be very shame aware if we're going to actually connect authentically with our own leadership moving forward. Of course, when you add stress into the mix, we often find that inauthenticity becomes more prevalent. So we are less balanced and more reactive. And in this particular season coming out of COVID pandemic, many leaders are feeling more unworthy, more discombobulated. And as a result, they feel more fraudulence and therefore more inauthenticity. And part of the pressure there is the pressure to have everything worked out. And so, if you like, inauthentic leadership plays a part of leadership, whereas authentic leadership is leadership as is. And I want to have a look at this idea for a minute in terms of, so this matrix here. So how do we lead authentically then if we're struggling with shame out of a pandemic? Well, what we're looking for here is the idea that actually how we express our certainty or uncertainty has a big impact on how we express our leadership, but also how we feel about our leadership. So in the 80s, traditional business ideas were that certainty was really significant for leadership. So if you were uncertain, that was unhelpful. And what you needed to do was maximize your expressions of certainty. So you feel ashamed and inauthentic, yet you have to say, this is the way things are going to go. I'm certain that we're going to make a profit in this quarter. In Christian leadership, I'm certain the church is going to grow on the outworking of this pandemic. To show uncertainty was problematic. The trouble is, on the matrix between being trustworthy and untrustworthy, things have also changed. In society, leaders aren't perceived anymore to be segregated leaders, leaders who are compartmentalized between their leadership expression and their personal expression. So we talk now a lot about culture in business, and culture has been one of the key elements of business transformation over the last 20 years. What people want are trustworthy leaders, not untrustworthy leaders. So what we can say here is that if I overexpress my certainty as a way of covering over my shame and inauthenticity, I'm also maximizing the sense that I'm untrustworthy. Therefore, I'm creating suspicion in the lower left-hand quadrant. If I'm demonstrating uncertainty and I'm also untrustworthy, I create terror in the people I'm trying to lead. But I can demonstrate trustworthiness and certainty, and that creates obviously optimism, which isn't always necessarily realistic, but it does create optimism in itself. But interestingly, if I'm trustworthy and I express uncertainty, I create assurance rather than terror. And I think this is really, really important for us today as we talk about authentic leadership off the back of a pandemic. Is the key thing here is to recognize that we're leaders who are called into a space for such a time as this. And our responsibility is not to create unrealistic certainty, but actually to position ourselves in line with the uncertainty that is real to our particular circumstance, to be trustworthy leaders who create assurance more than optimism, and certainly not leaders who create suspicion or terror. And this is really, really key in terms of our comprehension of what it looks like to be an authentic leader, because the call here is to trustworthiness rather than to storytelling. Rather than mystery creation, we're called to characterfulness, to root ourselves in the nature and person of Jesus Christ, to be transformed leaders. And again, that takes us back to a place of vulnerability to say, this is who I am, rooted and grounded in the Christ who loves me and died for me and has come to give me new life, not to make us more than we are, So there's a key wrestling here for us off the back of a pandemic, and lots of church leaders saying, look, I really want to create confidence in my congregation. How do I help them back in the room? I need to be sort of big on spiritual promises, and I need to be giving them a sense that I know exactly where we're going. And I'm saying, well, hold on a minute. Everyone knows that we're all struggling, and this is unknown territory. And actually, what people need to know is that your character is good and that you're trustworthy, and not that you know the way ahead, because actually that will create suspicion rather than the blessing of assurance. And this is a key challenge to us as leaders. We change what we traditionally have done for what actually we need to do to be perceived, if you like, rightly as authentic leaders. Well, not just perceived, but to live as authentic leaders. 82% of respondents to Deloitte's Global Human Capital Trends Survey said that culture, it has the potential to give us the competitive edge. They were saying culture matters, but only 19% approved of the culture that their businesses were orientated by, and only 28% could articulate what those cultures actually were. Culture is important. Everyone knows culture is important, but not everyone knows what that culture is. And if we're trying to be authentic in leadership, creating authentic culture where we can be vulnerable and ourselves and be known is foundational to today's world. So, as we said, in history, culture was not important. What was important was a bottom line. But in today's world, culture is fundamentally important. In fact, billions of dollars are pulled into company cultures today all around the world. But we often assume that we know what the culture is within our Christian organizations. The culture is Jesus. We just fail to articulate that culture. We fail to define that culture, and therefore we fail to grow out of that culture. So that's challenging. And it's particularly challenging because as we respond to all this, we can feel out of our depth and then begin, if you like, to hide in plain sight. So we might say, well, I need to create a certain culture. I need to try and create a narrative that everyone can understand. I feel insecure and fraudulent anyway, so now I'm hiding in plain sight. And for us in the Anglican Church, a dog collar creates quite a good superhero outfit where you can be seen but not really known. And the danger of hiding in plain sight is that you end up playing a part of watching yourself. And that is incredibly difficult because real praise is only real praise of a parody of yourself, and real criticism is only real criticism of a parody of yourself. So you neither receive praise nor criticism. So you're not transformed, celebrated, or disciplined. And we have to step into a place of authenticity, recognizing that shame would say, hide yourself. But God is saying, be revealed, be known. The center of the gospel is being known by God and knowing God. And one of the most powerful and evocative phrases in scripture was and they knew. It's often referenced to sexual union, but they knew one another. Is the deepest form of connection, how we might be known and know. And so the call here for us is to sort of acknowledge ways in which we might be diverting from being known and knowing in terms of revealing who we really are and how we're really struggling. Thinking a bit more about this idea of culture, and particularly in authenticity in leadership, point you towards Edgar Sheen's iceberg model. And this is the idea that actually in business culture and in ministry culture, there are three levels of culture. There's artifacts and creations. They're the things that we do. They're visible. They're like a statement of intent on your website. Then they're the values that we carry, which people say, oh, well, these are our values. And they're often written down and they're sometimes published in the church newsletter. But underneath all of these are the basic assumptions, the sort of taken for granted, invisible, pre-conscious beliefs that we have about ourselves. And I would say to us as leaders, if we don't address our basic assumptions, then they will never throw through the values and then the artifacts and creations of our culture. The key here is that we have to sort of analyze and assess ourselves, recognizing that our assumptions that we might be known and heard and understood aren't always true. Sheen says, even if we knew an organization well enough to live in it, we would not necessarily know how its culture arose. And for us, a key part of engaging in authentic leadership is asking ourselves, how did our culture arise? And that's why we go back to the shame basement statement, because there are two forms of learning around culture. There's learning anxiety and survival anxiety. And many of our modus operandi, many of our, if you like, our basic assumptions are orientated around survival anxiety. And we've defended ourselves and our shame basements from scrutiny because that makes sense in leadership. People will think I'm great. People will offer me opportunity. Then I'll begin to lead, and then I'll feel authentic. But of course, that is imposter syndrome worked out. It works perfectly, but it works terribly. You begin to inhabit the superhero space. Everyone believes in you. And how long do you live there before you reveal who you really are and say, hey, everyone, by the way, I'm actually this person? Of course, the whole thing tumbles down like a house of cards. We have to recognize that our culture as leaders often began in our anxiety that we aren't what we were, and we aren't what we need to be, we aren't what we ought to be. But by the grace of God, we are what we are. And so we have to reconnect again with this sense of actual revelation. Who is God calling me to be? Who am I in all of this? I want to just, sorry, my screen's got a little bit funny there. Just to share with you a bit more on this idea, is helping us to kind of connect that behind what we do, behind how we lead. Sorry, I think my screen is strangely reorientated. Sorry, am I still on the right level? Can you guys see that? So we have this idea that actually if we continue down a path of inauthenticity, the danger is that we end up having a shadow mission which we're fulfilling anyway, and it looks like we're fulfilling our true mission, the mission that God's calling us to do, but actually something else is growing up in the back room. And one of the great markers of authentic leadership is that our true mission, the mission that God's given us, and our true self are co-joined. This young Anakin Skywalker is going to become something else. He's on a mission to something else. But we're called to co-join our mission, the true mission that God's placed in our lives, and who we actually are. That makes us authentic. If we're not careful, we will work out of our shame towards fulfilling an insecurity with achievement and ultimately what looks like success in order to find a security which we'll never find. And I would say to you, some of the leaders that I've coached and supported over the years who've been really successful have not felt any semblance of security. In fact, they felt incredibly insecure. The higher up they've climbed, the more insecure they felt. And it's a terrifying place. And people are asking you, when can I climb down again? When can I get out of here? When can I be anonymous? I want to encourage you to think about a leadership that lasts, a leadership that's absolutely rooted in who you actually are, a vulnerable leadership. And one of the challenges here is that how can you do vulnerability? How can you lead with vulnerability? Well, the first thing to point out is that leading with vulnerability is coming back to that place of saying, I don't really know, but you can trust me. So vulnerability is not about achievable ends, it's about characterful ends. So what I'm often saying to developing leaders is you need to focus less on your achievements and more on your character. Ultimately, trust is the commodity of leadership. And the question that we're all asking now is, can I trust you? Far more than, can I follow you? Now, one will obviously follow the other, but I would say the question, can I trust you, is far more important than can I follow you? Because the can I follow you question always follows that I can trust you answer. If I can trust you, then I can follow you. But if I cannot trust you, I cannot follow you. And being trustworthy is not about being perfect. Being trustworthy is about being transparent. There aren't very many great definitions of authenticity around, but authenticate is a word which does have good definition, clear definition. It's something true, trustworthy, and clear or honest. It's authentic. And we're called to an authenticity here, not to a level of perfection. And out of this global pandemic, in our authenticity, in our truth and value, we've got to work with a greater level of transparency. Three things which are quite common to leadership at the moment as a result of the pandemic specifically are escaping from the pandemic in leadership, forgetting it almost ever happened, then corralling, strongly pushing people in a direction in order to, assuage our own anxiety that they're going to go somewhere else. And thirdly, instrumentalization, where we instrumentalize the pandemic for our own ends, or for the ends of our business or organization or even our church. These sort of ills will ultimately damage our leadership and also damage the people we're leading. And we're called to something else, something far more curious and uncertain, rooted in a greater confidence, a confidence that God is with us and for us, and you can trust me in leadership. That's the kind of key question, the key call. Think about that in terms of this little matrix. If we have a high relational value and high expectations for others, we will create a liberating culture of empowerment, innovation, and curiosity. In our leadership right now, we're looking for high relational value, investing in others, and having high expectations for what God can do amongst us. If we have a high relational value and low expectations, we become controlling of others. We don't share the goods. We try and do it all ourselves. If we have a low expectation culture and a low relational value, we abdicate our responsibility. We become apathetic to others. If we have high expectations but low relational value, we become domineering and create a culture of fear. But here we're saying, as authentic leaders, we have high expectations for what the Lord can do amongst us and for the people we're leading, and also a high relational value. And the key thing about high relational value, it says, actually, I'm going to be more transparent to you. I'm going to connect with you authentically. And people are not commodities. People are people. So if we commoditize the people we lead, we'll damage our leadership and them. Whereas if we are innately human in our leadership and connected, then we'll support their leadership and our own. Key decision here is to be a liberator, to be someone who is for you, who fights for the highest possible good, who's always looking to help you fulfill your true potential, someone who is not sure what to do, but knows how to care. And that's absolutely foundational to us kind of moving forward from here. We're going to have some time for questions in just a moment, but a key part just before we move into some questions is around this idea of actually, how do I do authentic, vulnerable, unshame-bound leadership without getting overwhelmed? And how do I keep the sort of dignity of myself versus others? So I just want to share this idea with you that actually there are three sorts of boundary state. There is codependent on the left, interdependent in the middle, and independent on the right. And authentic leadership is not about being a bleeding heart in the public square. It's not about codependency. Codependent people don't know where they end and other people begin. And actually, codependency is not a healthy form of leadership. It's not actually leadership at all. Independence is definitely not also authentic leadership. Independence says, I've got all the answers. I'm going to tell you where to go. And I'm ultimately segregated and single from you all. And I'm leading effectively from my own private bubble. And that's the greatest temptation for inauthenticity in leadership. It's like, I am over here, you are over there, and never the twain shall meet. What we're called to is interdependence, which is this porous boundary where we're clearly defined, and yet we're also able to interconnect, interrelate, and collaborate with others. I know where I begin and end, and I know where others begin and end, but together we are, if you like, on a leadership journey. And I would say all of us oscillate between codependency and independence, and our target area, our constant work is to retain interdependence, to recognize that we need others and others need us, but we're also defined. And that key value about saying, well, I'm willing to reveal who I really am, I'm leading out about who I really am, and I'm collaborating rather than actively in directing. That's the model of leadership that's most effective in the 21st century. And I think that's the model of leadership which will lead us out of the pandemic in terms of what people are really called for now. There's no doubt in my mind that culture has massively changed over the last 18 months. It's probably been the greatest accelerated change of workplace culture in the last 50 to 70 years. And so, so much has changed, and it requires us to pivot too. So ultimately, how can we make this real for ourselves? How can we land this? What the sort of takeaways? Well, so it's sort of a decision that we're making here to say, well, I accept my limitations, I welcome my uniqueness, and I'm going to lead out of my vulnerability, reliant on God's unconditional grace for me. This is the key decision we're making. Because ultimately, I believe that when Jesus died, he died in order to save us, not just from guilt, but also from shame. There's this amazing passage in Numbers where the snake of shame is sort of raised up on a pole, and everyone who looks at it is healed. And then in Hebrews it says, just as the snake was raised up on a pole, in the same way the Son of Man was raised up. In that sense that shame is overcome, that Jesus became our shame in order that we might become the righteousness of God. That actually we're not called to live in shame in authentic leadership. We're called to live in a righteous identity that's been created for us through Christ's death and resurrection. And so it's a spiritual as well as a practical leadership process. Here I am, Lord, use me. And I want to encourage you all to say, you're sanctified, and as you're sanctified, God will be glorified through your ministry and leadership. But we connect through our vulnerabilities, not through our strengths. And God is glorified in jars of clay rather than in sparkly diamonds. So my encouragement is to be authentic, to lead a jar of clay so the power of God might be manifest through your leadership in the weeks and months ahead. Great, we've got about 15 minutes or so for some questions. If you've got any questions, I'd love to try and answer some. I'll respond to anything. I've whistled through quite a lot of material, and I'm really happy to, if it helps you, to put some of that stuff on the website. I will send you the slide pack if you want to go through it in more detail.